Hey everyone, and welcome back to JavaScript in Metaphors. Today's topic is objects, and I worked a long time to try to come up with a good way of explaining this, and I came up with something, so we'll see how we go. But imagine that you're in your kitchen and you're ready to cook up a nice dinner, and you open a set of drawers looking for knives, and it's just full of underwear. Now you open the next drawer and it's just full of old video games. Now you haven't found the tools you need in order to make dinner, so you go over to the refrigerator, you open it up, and lo and behold, it's just full of garbage. Nothing is in its right place. And that's a problem. As human beings, we are used to having a logical order to things. We're used to grouping things together because it helps us reduce our cognitive load. What that means is that we don't have to think as much and use our limited resources on remembering where everything is all the time. So in the kitchen, you'd expect to find the food in the fridge, right? And when it's not there, you have to think and you need to remember where it is. So having a logical grouping somewhere to store things where they belong, like a refrigerator for food, is quite useful. And in JavaScript, we use a data structure called object in order to group things together. And the object is simply put a collection of keys and values. So it helps us to logically group our code together so it's easier to reason about. And it's central in a very popular programming paradigm called object-oriented programming, which is based on organizing code into objects that represent physical objects. So in this lesson, we'll have a look at the object and how we can use it in JavaScript. All right, so now we're back in Code Sandbox and we're ready to create our first object. So in our index.js file here, in our vanilla.js project, we're going to create a variable called refrigerator. And we are going to use something called the object literal. So that's going to be these two curly brackets here. And when we're using those and in the right context, JavaScript is going to know that we want to create an object. So now we have an empty object here. If we log this out, we'll see an empty object in the console. So we need to add some key value pairs to it. So the first thing we're going to add is temperature. And the temperature of this refrigerator is going to be -4. And then we will add some foods. And the key is going to be foods, and the value is going to be a string that we're just going to say apple, milk, meat, nuts, and juice. Now, if we log this out, you can see in the console we have an object and it has two key value pairs. The first is temperature, which is the key, and -4, which is the value. And then we have foods, which is the key, and the string apple, milk, meat, nuts, and juice. So now that we have those values on our object, we need to know how we can access them. And the way we can access them is to use the dot notation. So refrigerator refers to the variable label that we store our object in. So in order to access a key on the object itself, we can use the dot notation. So we'll say refrigerator dot temperature. And if we log that out, we get the value in the console. So these key value pairs works a lot like variables. The key is a label for the value. And when we reference that label on the object, we return the value itself. So it's the same with foods here. We can do console log refrigerator dot foods. And if we hit save on that, we get the foods here down in the console logged out. So there's another way we can access these properties, and it's with the bracket notation. So we could do refrigerator, and let me just remove these two. And we'll give it a pair of square brackets, and then we could write out the string key here. So if we say foods here, that's going to work the same way. We get the apple, milk, meats, nuts, and juice down here. And why is that useful? Well, imagine you had a variable called food descriptor, and you called it foods. Now, if you try to do this and access that with the dot notation, that's not going to work because the refrigerator has a key called foods. But here we're trying to access the food descriptor key, which doesn't work. So if we try to add the food descriptor here, let's see what happens. Then we would get the value associated with this key. But since we don't have that, this won't work. So in order to actually evaluate the variable here, we can use bracket notation. And if we now do food descriptor, that's going to evaluate to this value, and we'll be able to go on the refrigerator and access the foods key. All right, so that's a quick view into how we can create an object and how we can access the different key value pairs on an object. Now let's take a look at how we can delete values from an object. So in order to delete a value, we can use the del keyword. And we need to give it the refrigerator label. And then we need to say what kind of value we want to delete. And I'm sorry, it's not del, it's delete. So now if we try to console, if we try to console log the refrigerator foods, we're going to get back undefined. And you see that it's being logged out here. And that is because we are accessing it here, and then we are deleting it, and then we're logging it out. And the way JavaScript works, and we'll do a lesson on this later, is it goes line by line from the top to the bottom and executes the code that's there. So the reason this works is because this hasn't run yet. So at line 8, foods is still a key on this object. On line 10, it's no longer a key because we're deleting it. So when we're trying to log it out on line 12, we're going to get undefined, which you can see down here in the console. So if we remove that console log, what we expect to see if we refresh the browser is just undefined. All right, so let's take a look at how we are using objects in our chat application. And what we are looking for here is the dot notation that tells us that we are accessing a property on an element. So on line 8 here, you can see we are accessing the app container object and the class list property on that object. So what's happening here? On line 7, we are creating an app container variable. And that variable holds the result of calling this function. So we haven't covered this yet, but instead of this function, let's imagine we are saving an object here. And that object has a class list property, which is itself an object. And the way we know that is because we are chaining the next property here called add, which is a function. Now remember, an object can hold any valid JavaScript value as a value to a key. So the key of add here is holding a function. Now that we haven't gotten this far yet, but let's go ahead and just take a look at what this element might look like, because it might be fun just to see, even though we don't have the knowledge to understand everything yet. But let's just jump over to our sandbox and take a look at what this element could look like. All right, so we had element, and the element is the result of calling, document create element with div, right? So we can assume it has some sort of tag type. That's going to be div. Now, it also has a class list. And what we want is for the class list to be an array or a list of values. And to be able to do that, I'm just going to type it out and then we'll talk through it. So we're going to say create class list. That's going to be a function. And we're going to say classes equals array or list. And then we'll go ahead and we'll return an object, and that's going to have a getter on it. So if nothing makes sense right now, that's totally okay. Just bear with me. This is an example that we will continue to revisit as we learn more about functions and objects. So let's see here. We want to do classes push test. Or actually, we'll accept a parameter here. And we'll put that in here. And then instead of saying class list here, we'll do create class like this. So now if we do element and we log out the class list, what we expect is we'll get a list. And we didn't. So okay, so because we need to return the classes here. So we're expect to get a list, and then we can do console log element. We'll do class list again, and in between here we'll do element class list add my class. All right. So as you can see, we were able to update the class list in this instance. Now what's going on here? There's a lot of different concepts that we are using here, but let's just take a look at some of the things that are related to objects. So first off, we are creating a variable, and it's holding the element object. And on the element object, the first thing we see is a key value with a tag type, which is the name of the key, and then the value of the key is div. So if we console log the element dot tag type, we should see div in the console, and we do. So what is this? So this is going to look a little bit unfamiliar because we haven't covered these concepts yet. And this is a function, and the brackets here signify that we want to invoke this function. So what that means is the function is going to run, and all of the code inside of the function is going to run as a result. And what's happening inside the function? Well, if we look at line 13, we see that we are returning something that looks like an object. So if we take a look at what this is, basically we can take this and place that in here instead. So we are getting this part here on our object. All right. So let me just get back to where we started, because we want this function here. And what we have is a getter that is going to, whenever we refer to the class list, we want to return the classes, and we're adding a function to the class. So don't think about it too much for now. But basically, we are adding a new key to this object, and the key is this array, and it comes with some more properties. So I know that that's a little bit beyond what we've been learning so far, but it's quite interesting to see how it all is connected. And we'll get back to this as we keep going. But let's take a look at our application again. So you can see that we're using the class list add functionality in a lot of different places. And if we head into the sidebar, you can see that on the search field, we are accessing class list. We are using the name property and the placeholder property. So if we think about that, how does the search field look? Well, let's say it's a tag type and it has input, because we're creating the input type here. And then it has a name, which is going to be search, and as a placeholder, which is going to be search for conversation. So that is kind of the data structure representation of this. And we're accessing it with the dot notation that we saw from before. And I think, if we go through our application, we can see that we are using objects quite extensively. Basically, everything we're creating with create element is going to be an object, and we are operating on the different properties of that object throughout our application. All right, so that's it for the introduction of objects. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe, because it's going to help me massively, and it'll also keep you updated when I release new videos in this course. Now, thanks a lot for tuning in, and I urge you to practice these concepts on your own as usual, and I'll see you in the next video.